On a cold February night in 1978, 5 disabled young men living in California mysteriously disappeared. They were supposed to participate in a disabled basketball tournament the next day. They had even prepared their uniforms the night before. But that night, none of them would return home. Worse still, no one would be able to make sense of what I'm about to tell you. First of all, these 5 young men were close friends living around Yuba City, California, who were passionate about sports. The families had said that they were individuals with disabilities. 2 of them, Ted Wire and Jack Hewitt, had been diagnosed with mild intellectual disabilities, while the other 2, Bill Sterling and Jack Madruga, were described as having learning difficulties. In other words, they had slight cognitive impairments. Gary Mathias, on the other hand, was a former soldier who had served in the military. However, due to problems he experienced while stationed in Germany, he was diagnosed with schizophrenia and began receiving psychiatric treatment. Unlike the others, he did not have a condition from birth. So yes, all 5 of them had their own mental disabilities or conditions. However, this did not mean they were disconnected from life in any way. In their free time, the 5 friends would either play basketball together or watch games. They also played together on a team called the Gateway Gators, part of a rehabilitation program established for individuals with disabilities in Yuba. Additionally, each of them lived with their families and worked in various jobs. They were not people who could simply be labeled as mentally disabled and unable to take care of themselves. On the contrary, they were active individuals in society with abilities that complemented one another. But when the calendar showed Friday, February 24th, 1978, there was only one thing on their minds: the basketball game to be played the next day. On February 25th, the 5 of them were going to play their first game in a tournament with the Gateway Gators team. And if they won this tournament for individuals with special needs, they would earn a 1-week vacation in Los Angeles as a prize. Their excitement was so great that they had even prepared their uniforms and shoes the night before. So their families knew very well that their sons wouldn't want to miss this game. That's why, on that Friday evening, the 5 friends made a small plan to boost their morale for their own game the next day. They were going to travel about 80 kilometers to the city of Chico, watch an intercollegiate basketball game there, and spend some time enjoying themselves while following the sport they loved. For the trip, 2 people in the group had driver's licenses. One was the youngest, Gary Mathias, and the other was Jack Madruga. That evening, Jack would be behind the wheel. And around 6:30 p.m. on February 24th, 1978, they would set off from Yuba City. After a relatively short journey, they arrived at the stadium. The night had started off quite well for the 5 friends. After a pleasant journey, a great game, and a victory for the team they supported, it was time to head back home at around 10 p.m. Before leaving Chico, they stopped by a grocery store in the city center just as it was closing. Since they arrived right at closing time, the cashier gave them a bit of attitude. But in the end, they bought some snacks for the road, turned the music up, and began their journey home. Unfortunately, that annoyed cashier would be the last person to see those 5 young men. They got into their car, set off, and disappeared into the darkness. They had no idea it would be the last time they were seen alive. After getting their snacks in Chico, the 5 friends should have gotten into their car and started heading back to their homes in Yuba City. The route they were supposed to take was a straight, roughly 1-hour drive down through the Sacramento Valley. However, when the next morning came, it was noticed that none of the 5 friends had returned home, and their car was also missing. As a result, all the families quickly contacted each other, and when it became clear that none of them were home, the police were notified. However, in missing person cases, the first 24 hours were not usually considered an emergency for adults. Therefore, the police reassured the families and assumed that the young men had simply gone off on a trip. But when evening came and none of them had returned or made any contact, official missing person reports were filed. Search teams began scanning the main highway route that the young men might have taken while returning home from Chico. During the first few days, no trace of them was found. It was as if they had vanished into thin air along with their car. However, on February 28, 1978, an interesting coincidence occurred. That day, a forest ranger from a nearby county noticed that a car he had seen abandoned on patrol a few days earlier matched the vehicle of the missing young men. Announced in the newspaper, and he informed the police. This should have been good news. However, there was a problem. Yes, the vehicle was indeed theirs. The only difference was that the car that Ranger had seen was in a completely different direction from Chico. It was located in a mountainous area to the northeast, on a remote roadside in Plumas National Forest. This location had no connection to Chico or to Yuba City, where the young men lived. It was in a completely different direction. Therefore, although finding the car was initially encouraging, it only made the situation even more mysterious. The road where the car was found was a winding dirt forest road that was usually closed due to snow in winter. The elevation was around 1,300 meters, which was where the snow line began. In other words, if the car had gone a little further, it would likely have reached a snow barrier and been unable to continue. In fact, none of it made sense. How they ended up there was a complete mystery. In fact, even their families firmly believed that their sons would never have willingly driven off into the mountains like that. Jack's mother, in particular, repeatedly stated that Jack hated the cold. But now, what mattered was conducting a thorough investigation and following the clues. First of all, the car found by the roadside was not locked. One of the windows was even half open, yet there were no signs of any people or anything unusual around the vehicle. The car was found in a non-running condition, but it had no mechanical issues. When the police couldn't find the keys, they hot-wired the car and the engine started on the first try. There was also about a quarter tank of fuel left. So, considering all the information, the car was technically capable of continuing the journey, even without snow tires, or at least could have been pushed out of the shallow snow. After all, there were 5 adult men. They should have been in the car. There were also small clues inside the car that confirmed the story. For example, programs from the basketball game in Chico were found on the front seats. This showed that they had indeed gone to the game. In addition, the car contained wrappers from the food they bought at the market, empty soda bottles, candy wrappers, and even a milk carton. Aside from that, there was an unopened map in the glove compartment. So they even had road maps with them and didn't feel the need to use them. However, interestingly, the car key was nowhere to be found. In this scenario, the idea that the car broke down and they went to get help might seem possible, but neither the doors were locked nor the windows fully closed. Therefore, that theory didn't make much sense. Besides, the car was still in working condition and showed no visible issues. With so many confusing details, the teams initially didn't even know what to do or where to begin. However, one way or another, the search had to continue. Just as an intensive search and rescue operation was about to begin in the area after the car was found, a severe snowstorm hit, bringing 25 to 30 centimeters of fresh snow. As a result, any possible traces were unfortunately completely buried under the snow. Due to the heavy snowfall in the mountainous area, search and rescue operations had become nearly impossible. Although officials tried to make progress and carry out search efforts for 2 days, they also faced the risk of getting lost themselves, so the operations were suspended until further notice. With no trace or clue about the 5 men, finding them had become almost impossible. As the news began to spread, the police did receive several tip-off calls, but most of them were either false or inconsistent. Time was passing, and the 5 men still hadn't been found. With the forest buried under snow, the only chance of finding them would come with a change of seasons when the snow melted. Until winter ended and the spring sun melted the snow in the mountains, it was impossible to get any news about the men. Even though the police and search teams expanded the operation, scanning forest roads and conducting aerial searches by helicopter, there were no results until June 1978, as the snow melted toward the end of spring. Those who ventured into the forest would make a very grim discovery. On June 4, 1978, a group of young men who came to the area for off-road riding with their motorcycles reached a Forest Service campsite deep within the Plumas National Forest. This was a campsite located high in the mountains, used by firefighters and forest workers during the summer, and left empty during the winter. However, unlike what would normally be expected, the campsite had not been empty during the winter. One of the young men noticed that the window of the camp container was broken, looked inside, and saw a decomposed human body, then informed the police. What they found were the remains of the oldest member of the missing 5, Ted Wire. This news, which came after 3.5 months, unfortunately marked the end of all hope. When Ted's lifeless body was examined by the teams, The situation was horrifying. From a 32-year-old, 90-kilogram man, only a 40-kilogram body remained. Even more strangely, he was found lying on his back on a narrow bed in the caravan's single room, covered from head to toe with 8 layers of sheets, almost as if he had been carefully wrapped or swaddled. In other words, according to the reports, the position Ted was found in was not something he could have arranged by himself. According to the autopsy, the cause of death was starvation and hypothermia. At the time of his death, he was wearing only a thin t-shirt and pants. He had no shoes on and was lying in bed with just his socks. The most striking and saddest detail was that his beard had grown significantly long. According to information given by his family, he had shaved before leaving home, and it was estimated that such beard growth could only occur over a period of 8 to 13 weeks. This meant that Ted had survived for around 10 weeks. The fact that he had lost more than half of his body weight was also a clear sign that he had been starving for weeks. In other words, if he had been reached just a few weeks earlier, he likely would have been found alive. So if Ted had been alive all that time, where were the others? Why hadn't they done anything to save him? Unfortunately, the answer to that question came in the following days. After Ted was found, the searches between the container and the location where the car had been discovered were intensified. As a result, it didn't take long for new remains belonging to 2 people to be found along the side of a forest road, roughly halfway along the 20-kilometer distance. These remains belonged to Jack Madruga and Bill Sterling. Both of their bodies had been severely damaged by wild animals. Forensic teams who examined the bones determined that both had died from hypothermia, most likely on the night they went missing or within the following few days. It is possible that one of them gave up first, and the other refused to leave his side, ultimately meeting the same tragic fate. 2 days later, on June 7th, the youngest member of the group, Jack Hewitt, was found. Unfortunately, the person who found him was his own father. Jack was located about 3 kilometers away from the container, again deep in the forest. Although I say found, as mentioned before, none of these discoveries were in a complete state. The remains were scattered over a wide area, and it was only through detailed examinations that they were identified. He, too, had died from hypothermia. Thus, the clearest conclusion drawn from these remains, found one after another, was that each of them had frozen to death in the mountains. However, the 5th man, Gary Mathias, was nowhere to be found. No matter how hard the search teams tried, not even the slightest trace of Gary's body could be discovered. There were, however, some notable findings near the container. For example, 3 wool blankets belonging to Forest Service workers and a flashlight were found by the roadside, some distance away from the container. The flashlight was turned off, and it was never determined who had left it there or when. The most interesting discovery, however, was inside the container. The sneakers of Gary, who had been diagnosed with schizophrenia and was never found dead or alive, were also found inside that container. They were right next to the bed where Ted had been lying, but Ted was missing one of his shoes. Therefore, a theory emerged. Perhaps Ted and Gary had made it to the trailer. Gary's shoes got wet, so Ted wore them and went out to look for help. Even if that were the case, Gary would never have been able to make it back. This became one of the biggest mysteries of the case of the 5, and it still remains unsolved. But the most puzzling and chilling part was still on the trailer side. This Forest Service trailer was actually, technically, a shelter stocked with survival supplies for emergencies. And if you were stranded on that mountain, it would have been the best place to stay. It contained a storage full of provisions, including food rations used by the U.S. Army, known as sea rations. During the investigation around the trailer where Ted was found, it was also determined that 36 cans had been opened and consumed. So it seems that after taking shelter there, Ted, and most likely Gary, discovered those canned foods and consumed them to avoid starving. In fact, there was enough food stock to last for an entire year. Additionally, in the kitchen area of the trailer, there was a stove connected to an external propane tank and a valve that operated the heating system. In other words, by simply turning a valve, the inside could have been warmed, and they would have had a working stove. When the teams arrived and checked, they found that the valve, the heating system, and the tank were all full and in working condition. In other words, nothing was missing. They could have lived there comfortably for months. Moreover, even if we assume nothing worked, there were dozens of matches inside, along with firewood ready to be burned, as well as furniture and chairs. Since they had already found food, if they were afraid of freezing, they could have burned those to keep warm. But they hadn't done that either. It was simply impossible to comprehend. In short, despite having everything that could save their lives, not even a single match had been struck. No fire had been lit in the stove. As a result, this situation drove not only investigators like me and you, but also the families to frustration. But that was the reality of the situation. There were dozens of questions. What had happened to the five? Why had they stopped? Why had they taken the wrong road? Why had they split up? They even distributed his photos to nearby mental institutions, thinking he might have made it back to civilization in a disturbed mental state. But no, he would never be found. That was the situation. If you have any ideas, I can't wait to read your comments, because I couldn't come to any logical conclusion in this story. Even if we set aside those who couldn't reach the trailer, Ted's death and Gary's disappearance made no sense at all. Then again, there were many things that didn't make sense. Something must have forced or misled them. If the car was still operable, why did they leave it there? And even if they did, why did they walk further ahead instead of going back the way they came? Ted and Azelle had died of starvation in a place full of food. Just one of the many questions for you. The official investigation is still open. Since there was no clear evidence of assault, Gary was never found, and no definite conclusion could be reached, the case has not been closed. In police records, it remains classified as a mysterious disappearance and death case. As you like and subscribe, I'll be heading off to work on the next video. I'm Bachunigma.